Hi, everyone, and welcome to Fashion Decipher. My name is Sean Williams, and this episode we'll be talking about the Battle of Versailles. If you're not too familiar with the Battle of Versailles, it was a epic fashion show night that took place back in 1973, where American fashion was finally respected and just debuted in a way that French designers it awakened them to really what American design was, because prior to that they weren't really respected. But let's get into it. We're also going to talk about how Black models won the night and actually helped the battle be what it was. So the Battle of Versailles fashion show was a show that took place on November 28th, 1973. And the reason why this battle ever took place was because the Palace of Versailles was deteriorating and it needed to be restored. The concept of the battle was created by Eleanor Lambert. And for all those who are not familiar with Miss Lambert, she was an American fashion publicist. She was the one that was responsible for the increase of and the popularity of the American fashion industry that we know today. American fashion designers did not have the same following or credibility as European fashion designers. And we'll get into that later on why. But Eleanor Lambert, was this doyen of PR. She was one that founded New York Fashion Week, the Council of Fashion Designers of America, and the Met Gala, as well as the International Best Dress List. So, all these things that you may or may not know was created by her. She had a conversation with Gerald Van de Kamp. He was the curator of the Palace of Versailles. And, Versailles was a place of the government until 1789. And it just basically was like abandoned and not taken care of. And Van de Kamp sought to fund its restoration. And Lambert suggested a solution. And the solution was have a fashion show. And the fashion show would also be a dinner party afterwards, and it would feature 5 French designers and 5 American designers that kind of battle each other. And her goal was really to raise the standard and position of American designers, of the French designers, of the time. So the 5 French designers were Givenchy, Pierre Cardin, Yves Saint Laurent, Emmanuel Ungaro, and Marc Bohan for Dior. And the 5 American designers were Stephen Burrows, Halston, Anne Klein, Bill Blass, and Oscar de la Renta. Paris felt that they had the bar, like they really were the bar of fashion, and no one else can match, their level of design or designers. And this was some way that, Eleanor Lambert wanted to like level that playing field. With the American designers, you may or may not know some of these names, but they were all brands, except for Oscar de la Renta, that were into ready to wear. Oscar was more like dresses, he studied haute couture in Paris himself. They were all about clothes you can wear in the moment, stylish, but comfortable, and not, as I mentioned, haute couture that was like heavily influenced by the Parisians, and it wasn't made to order, and it wasn't hand stitched or hand sewn. It was probably manufacturer produced ready to wear, in comparison to what haute couture is. So let's get into each of the designers. So Stephen Burrows was African-American designer who was from Newark, New Jersey. And he was a newbie on the scene, and he wasn't a client of Eleanor Lambert's PR. He really wasn't anybody that people, he didn't have like a long standing in fashion at this point. He had just won the Coty Award, and his designs were like the freshness. They represented the freshness that were taking place in the streets of New York City at the time. You had, such a like a fresh look in the 70s. 70s styles were like very laid back and sensual and sexual, and Stephen Burrows had like parts of that in it. And all the rest of the designers were already established outside of him, and they all had a following in New York. Anne Klein was one of the other designers, and she was one of the designers that Paris didn't even want to come to the battle because she was a woman. They didn't respect that, and they just didn't think her clothes, because they were sportswear, they weren't considered high fashion. She was a Brooklyn native, and she basically designed clothes for the working woman and not for someone who considered to be high, society. So they didn't think she really represented high fashion and didn't think she belonged. But Anne Klein was Eleanor Lambert's client, and she wanted her to be there. Oscar de la Renta was the Dominican boy. He's a Dominican-born designer who designed looks that were picture perfect for women. His clothes was just represented to be beautiful and make women look gorgeous, and they would wear them to like society clothes. He moved to Paris at 18 from the Dominican Republic and was apprenticed to designer Balenciaga and Castillo. So he had like a lot of Parisian study under his belt. Bill Blass was from Indiana. He worked at Maurice Rene, and he later bought them in 1953, and he later named it Bill Blass Limited. He grew the line to be more than women's wear, into swimwear, furs, luggage, perfume, accessories, and then he later started a menswear brand that was really known for its tailoring. In the documentary about the Battle of Versailles, they say a lot of his demeanor that he carried around was of a character, which reminds me of what we talked about in last episode with Ralph Lauren. He created more of a persona and a character, less really about himself. So I would say if you don't know about that, go back and listen to that episode as well. We reviewed the documentary of Ralph Lauren. Anyway, the next American designer was Halston, which was really popular at the time. He was born in Iowa, and he reinvented what the American style was. He kept clean lines. He had just like stripped down, bare look to him, but very sensual, very sexy. And Halston basically turned down Eleanor Lambert's invitation to appear in the battle, which he later changed his mind. For him, he was very celebrity driven, and he understood the power of celebrities. And he just couldn't pass up an opportunity that this exposure could bring for him. And for entertainment, portion of the show, they brought in Liza Minnelli. At that time, she had just won an Oscar for her performance in the movie Cabaret. So she was part of the American entertainment, and so much had happened in the decades leading up to the 70s when the battle took place. The 70s was an era, like I was talking about before, where fashion saw a change. The freedom to dress and to express your personal beliefs within your clothes and self-expression and cultural pride was just exploding at this time. Robin Givon, who wrote the book about the Battle of Versailles, she made a statement that says, like, I feel that Burroughs and Halston were doing such similar work in terms of like the mood with like the jersey and the clinginess and the sensuality and the dresses that are close to the body. But she felt that Halston had cleaned it up and glammed it up for the uptown audience within New York City. And Burroughs like left it raw and unfinished for the downtown audience. You think of like the Village and like Soho and the LES, kind of more of that scene, which I think that like sums it up perfectly. So, the fashion of the American style was deeply different than what was going on in Paris. It was just totally different. American fashion designers, and Robin talks about this in the book, really weren't respected at all within fashion industry. A lot of times you had these designers that was designing for Bergdorf Goodmans or designing for Neiman Marcus or, any of these high Bonwit Taylor, any of these high-end retail locations that would kind of copy what the Parisians were doing and put it under the name of the department store. So they never wasn't really creating fashion. They were recreating Parisian fashion. French fashion. It wasn't like an American style. So they didn't have the respect that the French designers had. And I think not that I think, but I know the battle helped change that. So let's get into the Parisian designers that showed during the Battle of Versailles. As I mentioned prior, everyone before was established. They ran haute couture houses, the high style of design, and it was made by hand and it was unique and made to order. And the style of the way that Paris showcased their fashion shows, if you have seen any old footage of like Dior or from the House of Dior or Chanel, models basically, or Balenciaga, models basically carried numbers, and those numbers represented the items that they wore. So the purchasers could identify the item that they wanted to buy. And the shows took place without much fanfare, very quiet. And every onlooker like looked at each piece up and down. No like showmanship, no music, no rhythm, no no excitement, no form outside of just really the clothes, no performance. It wasn't performance driven, the old runway shows. So some of the fashion designers that were invited of the five for the French side was Yves Saint Laurent, and YSL was born in French Algeria, and he founded the House of YSL in 1961 with him and his then partner Pierre Barge. And he was extremely skilled in haute couture. And, he won the chance, everybody knows the story that he won the chance to work under Christian Dior, in which he created the trapeze dress. And that was like one of his most famous looks under Dior. And then, he had to walk away from Dior as he was sent away for war at that time. So that's, and then he came back, he created his own fashion house. Then you have Emmanuel Ongaro. He was born in France to a father that was a tailor, and he taught him his trade. When he moved to Paris, he was working under the designer of Balenciaga, very similar to Oscar de la Renta on the American side, and Andrew Corrigas, very similar to that as well. And he later owned his own fashion house. And I think he recently passed away back in, like, I think 2019, I believe. The next designer up is Marc Bohan for Christian Dior. And Marc Bohan designed for Christian Dior against, I think, the London version or the London label of Dior after Yves Saint Laurent, right before Yves Saint Laurent went to war, and he was called away to military service. And then he took over the main line of Dior, the head of the brand of Dior. And just a year prior, he was like in a more like reduced role. By Yves Saint Laurent's movement into military, it gave him much more of a broader opportunity. And his styles design was like simple yet elegant, but also very rigid. It didn't have like a lot of full creativity to it. It was very tailored, or it looked in a certain way that, as I was saying, like rigid. It didn't really give any, like, you think of Galliano for Dior, very different, more theatrical, where Bohan really didn't have that look. The next one up, designer up, is Givenchy. And he was born in France. And on his maternal side, he had artists, people who worked within the tapestry department and set design. His peers in fashion was Pierre Balmain and Christian Dior, and his idol was Balenciaga. By the time like the battle was created, he had already designed for Audrey Hepburn for the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's. And he created that balloon coat and the baby doll dress. He recently passed away. And lastly, we have Pierre Cardin, the Italian-born French naturalized citizen who worked for several fashion houses before he got to Dior, and then creating his own brand line, which he also recently passed away. But getting into like the designers and their background, just to give you an idea of who they are if you don't know, Yves Saint Laurent brought like, new changes to the fashion industry in the 60s and 70s. He was slowly getting into ready to wear. And, he opened his own pret-a-porter house in 1967, where he started to shift his focus from haute couture to ready to wear. And one of the purposes was to provide a wider range of fashionable styles being, chose from, buyers, of women buyers in the market. They were also affordable and much cheaper than the haute couture pieces. So he was seeing where the fashion style was going, and he was adapting to it. But it wasn't so much as it was until after the Battle of Versailles. That definitely changed the way a lot of French designers just started to design their pieces and their collections. So you have 5 American designers, as you mentioned, you have the 5 French designers, and they're there to help fund or show support or help raise money to restore Versailles. But because Versailles was just like in such a disarray, the conditions were so bad for them to even be working in. They made the best of it, but some of the conditions that they have recorded or they talked about was just horrible, from just nothing glamorous. I mean, the building was glamorous, they said, but it didn't have heating. It didn't have bare necessities. They didn't have toilet paper. It just was bad. Like windows, it didn't have ventilation, so just the basic necessities across the board for these models to be working in, or the French designers to be at, were just deplorable. And a lot of them were just miserable. So you add all of this up, And then on top of which the egos, and because there was several arguments that went on, behind the scenes, one of which was like infamous that came from Halston. They say in the Battle of Versailles documentary that Halston walked out of the event and was not to show up again until the day later of the event, acting like nothing happened. Extremely toxic. But that's just what he did. And Liza Minnelli, after she stepped up and said after he had the argument and he walked out, she encouraged everyone to stay and to continue the show. Like, you don't leave the show. So she just really helped everybody who was in shock that this happened and thought the show was over, just to continue what you started. So getting into the show part of it, the French presentation, many, who were there recounted as very stuffy. They had like elaborate sets, and I think Pierre Cardin had a rocket ship on the set. They had an orchestra. It was very elegant, very chic, but also very boring. Their performer though was like it was Josephine Baker, and it was like the thing that helped their performance, but just not enough to save it. Josephine Baker was described as wearing a very heavy fur that she threw off when she got to the stage, and she had a feather headdress and a rhinestone bodysuit. So you already know, if you know Josephine Baker, like the showmanship and the performance looks that she would wear. And he said her performance was just beautiful and outstanding. It just wasn't enough to help the French designers and their portion of their show. It still was not as great or as competitive or compared to the American part. The basis of the French presentation was more about the sets. And, I was saying before that it had like these elaborate sets, and the models really weren't the thing that was showcased. It wasn't about the clothes. And that was part, as the book and the documentary talks about, part of their misstep. And also the clothes themselves weren't of the moment. As we talked earlier, American fashion in the 70s were changing. And the French designers held steadfast to their heritage, the heritage of couture. The clothes of the moment were free and flowing and sensual and sexy. And it just wasn't that on their end. And also the show was 2.5 hours long, they said, like everyone who was there. And it just was way too long. People just got bored. And many say that it was just part of the parts that made the French show just unbearable. And no one remembers what the clothes look like. Everybody who talks about it in the documentary and within Rob McGivon's book, like, no one remembers what the French clothes were. It just was such a long show with just so many moving parts. The clothes themselves were forgettable. But they did have a lot of celebrity backing. They had the who's who were there, like royalty of like Grace Kelly and film stars like Jane Birkin, so they had a lot of French royalty there. So the celebrity side on the French side was great. It's just that the performance themselves, it just was dated. So in comparison, the American show was so different. The Americans turned out that it was less about the set and more about the clothes and more about the models. The reason why it was less about the set, I mean, they just didn't have a set to start with. In a documentary, they talked about the set designer didn't measure the set in the proper metrics. So they really didn't have anything in the back. Maybe, I believe they did say there was just like an image of a drawing of the Eiffel Tower. So there was no real backdrop and nothing part of that presentation, but just the looks and the energy from the models. That really was what was showcased. And the only music that the models performed to, there was no orchestra like the French side. They had music from a cassette player. And also their show was only 30 minutes. So that it just gave an energy, like you were getting hit back to back to back with American designers and what their looks were. Beth Ann Hardison was in the documentary. She was also in Battle of Versailles. She was one of the models that showcased there. She said Anne Klein reached out to her because her collection was, ethnically inspired and she needed her help. The look of Anne Klein's clothes in this collection was African. It was an African inspired. The women wore bodysuits and beaded necklaces. And the French, after Anne Klein's models came out, the French were just amazed about the amount of skin that was shown and just the nudeness of the clothes. They just couldn't believe it. The next designer to present was Stephen Burrows. His presentation was full of African-American models. the color of his pieces, just the color blocking, the bright colors, that's so much of Stephen's aesthetic. It was all about art and color and music for him. And all of that came out in his designs. And when the models walked the runway, they walked it with such movement and such attitude. And again, this is not anything that the French have seen. That's not how they see models walk runways. So it was so different to them. It was so new to them. And Black models weren't really used in the fashion scene in Paris that much. They were used though. It's important to note that several French designers did use Black models, but not to this amount that was being used. So that again, that was another additive that was different for the American designers. At the end of Burroughs' show, Beth Ann said she walks out. This is in the documentary. She says she walks out while the rest of the models pause at the end of the stage, and she stops towards the end and throws down the train to her dress in such dramatic attitude she gave. And she said she stared out into the crowd. And the French went wild. They stomped their feet and threw their flyers in the air, and they were screaming bravo, and they were clapping, and they just didn't see anything like that before. And just each designer back to back kept giving the audience something that they didn't get with the French designers. So right after Stephen Burroughs came Bill Blass. His clothes were just based upon the glamour of the jazz era. The models were given binoculars and walking sticks or canes, and the models were dressed like something straight out of The Great Gatsby. It had elegance and flamboyance. Right behind Bill Blass was Halston, and his looks was described as magical and elegant. A lot of it played off the lights of the stage, on the stage. And model Alva Chen said that the collection was like an homage to Folies Bergère. And what was interesting is that Alva was dressed in an asymmetrical black dress that Halston designed for her, with a red hat with a feather boa attached to it. And the dress left one of her breasts exposed. Think Little Kim at the VMAs without the pasty 22 years earlier. And to add that, China Mercado was in Halston's lineup as well. And she said Halston had designed a look for her that was just basically a skirt and a feather fan that just she held to cover her breasts. And she said in the documentary that Halston kept telling her to move the fan, but she was not removing the fan to expose her breasts. Pat Cleveland has such an interesting part of Halston's show. He told her to pretend that she was a moth. So Pat Cleveland wore this like long ruffled dress with like layers. And she twirled, they said, from the beginning of the runway all the way to the end, which frightened many of them because they didn't know if she was going to stop. But they said she stopped like right before the end. And the French audience was astounded. And Oscar de la Renta presented last. He had models walk out to Barry White's Love Unlimited orchestra instrumental song. And they just graced the runway in all his beautiful designs, just such Hollywood and beautiful looks and cuts to them. And the lead model of his showcase was Billy Blair. She's an African-American model, and she led every other model out. She was like the leader of all of them. So those were all the presentations of the American side. And what's interesting about it, towards the end, they talk about how much the audience just said, you guys have, the American designers and models have stolen the heart of the French. You really won the battle. We have never seen anything like this. At the dinner after the battle, they were all just enamored with them and just wanted to talk to them and just really wanted to kind of speak to what inspired them and that presentation. And in the documentary, Beth Ann Hardison has this really touching moment. And she says that Yves Saint Laurent told her that Stephen Burroughs was the only American designer. And she just really was brought to tears at that moment. And right behind that, Mr. Burroughs appears and he says Saint Laurent told him that he made beautiful clothes. And it was two moments they both say that they would never forget. And that is very touching, you know, for the French side not to think, not to have sour grapes and feel that they lost or was sore losers in any way. They congratulated them for such a successful show and battle. So the night wasn't just a hit for the presence of American fashion designers, also for American woman designer of Anne Klein, but it also was a hit for Black music because they showcased Barry White's music. They also showcased Al Green's music. But the main part of it also too was the Black models that were in the show. Pat Cleveland to Beth Ann Hardison to Billy Blair, for Jennifer Bryce to Alva Chin, Norma Jean Darden, Charlene Dash, Barbara Jackson, Ramona Saunders, and Amina Wasuma. These were all the models who did the Battle of Versailles, who walked in it and performed in it. And together, they composed nearly 30% of the American roster in that show. And in 2011, the Huffington Post gave them the Game Changer Award. Just honoring them for being the African American models of Versailles. And they also gave a style award to Black designer Stephen Burrows. So this amazing performance, of 10 Black women models who opened doors for future Black models on European catwalks. This is not to negate that the future Black models still didn't have their struggles. And to this day, there are still very much struggles for Black models. But it was important to note that this was a door that they were able to open for them. This got them in the door. So, if you are interested in learning more about the Battle of Versailles yourself, please read Robin Givon's book, The Battle of Versailles. It is such a great read. And watch the Battle of Versailles documentary. It is available on Amazon Prime. And we will be posting photos of what some of these beautiful looks and how the models looked during that night on our social media pages. So thank you for tuning in to this episode of Fashion Decipher, and I will speak to you next week. Bye. Hi guys, it's Sean. Make sure you visit our website, fashiondecipher.com, to get a visual on what we're talking to you about. Check out pics from events, of guest speakers, and exhibits. If you miss anything we post, you can visit our archives page. Also, while you're there, hit that subscribe button, leave your email, and if you like, a comment. Tell us what you think or what you would want to hear on an upcoming episode. Don't forget to follow and friend Fashion Decipher on social media. Check out what we're up to. Speak with you next week.